The Water Wars of 2074. An original post-apocalyptic story by the author, Declan Conner. Chapter 1. Ethan Jacobs prayed for rain, as he did every evening before going to bed. The big guy upstairs never listened, he thought, then set his chainsaw to one side and sighed. He'd taken a break from felling trees to create a wider break from any wildfires around that he knew would likely pay him a visit one day to his homestead. Ethan dropped his backside on the bench seat at his porch out of the searing heat, exhausted. Reaching to his side, he retrieved a rag from his jacket pocket and wiped the sweat from his brow. He'd never thought that living off of the grid, isolated within the 2 million acres of Shasta Trinity Forest in what was now Cascadia, with over 6,000 miles of rivers and streams, that water would now be more valuable than platinum. Ethan sat there, racking his brain to come up with a means to make a meager living to supplement his own produce to feed his family. With water now so scarce, his only income of producing maple syrup had evaporated along with an abundant water supply. He knew he could hardly sell what he had at the local fair and swap meats, or they'd know he'd have water. It grieved him as he pondered that game was getting scarce, leaving only the carcasses of wildlife for the scavengers to gnaw on in any numbers. Even the trees were hibernating after the record-breaking 6-year drought, leaving a carpet of leaves and undergrowth as fuel for wildfires. He knew that the evaporated water had to come down somewhere and some poor souls would be suffering floods, but at least they didn't have to worry about a water supply just getting swept away. Ethan sighed, just thankful that God had provided him with an artisan well from a source of underground water, but there was no telling how long that would last. At least with the sun constant, his solar panels ensured a constant supply of energy, he thought. With many of the other homesteaders having had to abandon their properties when their wells had dried up, he knew it would be only a matter of time before he too would be pumping up sludge, and he'd have to rely on what he had stashed in reserve in his bunker. Ethan's wife, Sarah, she interrupted his train of thought, calling out to him through the open kitchen window.
"Greg's on the radio for you. He sounded panicked. Says he has to talk urgently, so better get in here."
Coming, he called back and eased off of the bench to head into his den in the cabin. He picked up the mic. "You there, John?"
"Reading you loud and clear. We're under attack, but my sons are out there holding them off. I have some of the other homesteaders coming to help, but you're the nearest and we're running out of ammo."
In the background he'd heard the gunfire, so he knew John wasn't crying wolf. "Calm down. I'll get my son Jason and get over there. How many of them are they?"
"We're getting fire from 4 positions. Hurry, I have to go. Oh, shit."
"John, you there? Speak to me." Chapter 2. The transmission stopped to static, so he put down the mic. It wasn't like he could say no after John and his sons had helped him ward off an attack on his own homestead. Sarah had been standing at the door listening.
"Oh, hell, in God's name no. I heard that. I'd better get Jay. Then I'll get to the bunker until you're back. For Christ's sake, stay safe and look after Jay."
They hugged, then she disappeared outside. Ethan lifted the floorboards and retrieved 2 bottles of water and stuffed them in his backpack, then he retrieved another 2 for Jason. With 2 pistols holstered and the straps of his scoped hunting rifle and an automatic over his shoulders, he set off outside to the buggies and removed the charger cables. Jay arrived and he tossed in the water bottles one at a time, then with the electric motor engaged, they were off. Charging along the trail, the suspension bounced him around, at one point taking off and landing with a jolting bump. It seemed as though the journey to John's homestead was taking a lifetime, when he slowed and held up his arm, showing his palm to Jay for him to stop. "We go on foot from here," he said, with the sound of gunfire audible. They'd gone no more than 100 yards, when the gunfire had stopped. He couldn't be sure if it was a lull in hostilities, or if he was too late. By the time they'd stalked to the hillside to get a view of the homestead, he could see he was too late. He brought the scope of his hunting rifle to bear on the scene. Jason did likewise. "You skin left and I'll take right," Ethan said. He recognized John's 2 sons laying on the ground with their rifles beside of them, both clearly dead. "Any sign of John?" Ethan asked. Jay shook his head. There were 2 more bodies face down, and unless John had visitors, he guessed they were hostiles they'd taken out. The single shot that rang out sounded as though it came from inside the cabin. He wondered if after seeing his sons dead, John had saved the last bullet for himself. That notion dispelled itself when a guy appeared at the front door and holstered his pistol. Then he waved across at the tree line and stepped back inside. A buggy with a trailer appeared from the tree line, with 2 more of them with rifles. He could see it wasn't any of the other homesteaders. He turned to Jay, cupping his hand over his mouth.
Best we wait until all 3 are out in the open. Keep observing for if there are more of them. Better if we wait to see if the other homesteaders arrive, just in case more are in hiding. If not, as soon as they're out in the open, let them have it.
Jay nodded, not taking his eye from his scope. Ethan noticed a cloud of dust appearing over the trees. He prayed that it was the other homesteaders and not more looters. A sigh of relief escaped his lips when he saw a tractor with a trailer appear with Archie, a fellow homesteader, driving, with his sons and his wife in the back on the trailer. The relief turned to confusion when they pulled up at the cabin and started to unload plastic cooler bottles from their trailer. The guy he'd seen holster his pistol stepped outside and Archie shook hands with him. Rage boiled inside of him at the betrayal. To think Archie was responsible for John's family's deaths defied belief. Chapter 3. He watched the other 2 looters carry out a deer carcass and they tossed it onto the back of their trailer, then hauled off plastic cooler bottles. Archie's wife stepped over to the water pump with her sons and they started to fill the bottles. It didn't take a rocket scientist to work out that Archie and his family had gone into bed with the black marketeers. An off-road vehicle came into view with a trailer laden with water cooler bottles. There were 2 guys in the back on the trailer and 4 climbed out of the vehicle, all armed. Ethan knew he'd been right to observe. Even with the firepower they had between himself and Jay, it would have been like taking a knife to a gunfight. They'd have been so outnumbered. He knew he had to decide what to do next. Jay tugged at his sleeve.
What do we do now, Pa?
Truth was, he couldn't see what he could do, but he had to reply.
Nothing we can do, only observe. But one thing more precious than the water down there is our lives. Just remember that. Better hope that John contacted more homesteaders than Archie.
2 of the looters carried out John's body and hauled it over to the tree line, then swung him by the arms and legs and tossed him into the undergrowth like he was garbage. It pained him to watch them do the same with his sons, while putting their own dead on the back of their trailer. Jay tapped him on the shoulder and pointed. He already heard arriving what Jay had seen and cast his vision at 4 more SUVs arriving and they parked outside the cabin. As they exited their vehicles, his innards sighed that there were another 16 of them to contend with, all armed with rifles. If the odds were bad before, they were now impossible. One of them seemed to be in charge, barking out orders. The guys dispersed, heading for the perimeter at the tree line. 2 of them stepped over to Archie and his family at the pump and raised their rifles. There hadn't been a chance to defend themselves with their backs to their assailant. They'd paid the price for their own betrayal. He wasn't about to feel sympathetic for their demise. He was more concerned at seeing the assailants head in their direction toward the bottom of the hillside. Ethan turned to Jay.
Nothing we can do here, only save our own skins. Best we get back to your mom.
Thinking about saving their own skins, Ethan became consumed with thoughts that they could eventually turn up at his homestead. He prayed to God he was wrong. Chapter 4. They crept away to work their way back to their buggies to head home. Ethan's mind worked overtime on the journey. He knew there was only one thing to do, and that was to contact the Cascadian National Guard for help. That would mean going into town to their food and water distribution depot, which he didn't relish. All the same, there was no way of knowing if Archie had given away the location of their homestead. He hadn't wanted to frighten his son, but if those black marketeers were who he thought they were, the few homesteaders left would be no match for them. He began to worry that they could already be at his property. Approaching the clearing to the homestead, he slowed then stopped. Jay pulled up alongside of him. Go check the trail cameras to the left, I'll check the others, then meet back here. If they're clear back to when we left, we can go on in and get your mom. Jay scampered away and Ethan set off around the perimeter to check the cameras. With no sign of intruders, they headed into the homestead clearing on their buggies, then drove to the barn and left them on charge. In the barn, Ethan lifted the cover for the alert button and pressed it for Sarah to hear they were back, then the both of them stepped over to stand in front of the camera high in the rafters and waited there for her to arrive. When she arrived, Ethan told a shocked-looking Sarah all they had witnessed. She sat there with her head in her hands. She removed her hands and raised her vision with a look in her eyes that she was scared.
Oh, my God. What we gonna do now? We can't just wait for them to come here next.
Look, don't worry. I'm going to have to go into town. I want you two to stay in the bunker until I return with the National Guard. Sarah stiffened up and stood there with her hands on her hips.
I don't like the idea of you going alone. We should all of us go.
That would take too long in the buggies. We need the guards here, like yesterday. I'll take the drone transport and it only has one seat. Trust me, I'll be fine and back in no time. You'll be safe in the bunker. Jay put his arm around his mom.
Pa's right. I trust him to get back here. I'll look after you, don't you worry. We'll be safer in the bunker and we can see from the cameras if the looters arrive here. Pa knows what he's doing.
Ethan and Jay exchanged glances. By the look on Jay's face, he could see that he'd said that more out of hope than certainty. Sarah expelled a soulful sigh, an appearance of silent resignation etched on her face. He turned to Jay. Come on then, give me a hand to get the drone transport out of here. Ethan removed the charger and they wheeled it outside on the carry frame. With the motors fired up, the drone began to rise. Sarah put her arm around Jay's waist and they both waved as he rose above the tree canopy and set off to town. All he hoped was that the repair he'd carried out on one of the motors would hold up to get him there and back safely. Chapter 5 20 miles into the journey and to the south at another 40 or so miles in the distance he could see a wildfire raging. Thankfully, it appeared the wind was sending it further south. There wasn't any sign of choppers or aircraft attempting to douse the flames. It appeared the authorities were just going to let it take its course. Another 10 miles along his flight and he saw the lights for the town as the sun disappeared over the horizon. As he neared, it wasn't just the street lights he could see, there were buildings on fire. At the outskirts he could see the floodlights at the National Guard compound and headed over there. A searchlight picked him up and he slowed to hover to the side of the barrier and then landed to be surrounded by guards, rifles shouldered. He didn't need to be asked as he held his hands in the air. A guard stepped over and rough-handled him out of the drone. He patted him down and removed his pistols while another took his rifles and backpack from the drone. Check my jacket pocket. I have the Homestead Authority certificate from the Forestry Commission to carry weapons. I'm here to report an attack by black marketers on my neighbor's homestead. I need to see your commander. The guard said nothing, simply signaling with the sway of his arm to go through the pedestrian entrance. A group of soldiers were stood around an upturned wooden box with two of them playing a card game. Their uniforms weren't the only thing different about them as they laughed and joked and jabbered in what sounded like Chinese. Asked to wait outside the commander's hut, he scratched at his hair, wondering what they were doing there, when he was asked to step inside and to take a seat. Good of you to see me. We have an urgent problem near my homestead. He went on to explain what had occurred. The guy smacked his lips. He'd appeared indifferent to his request for help.
Hell, that really is tough on your neighbors, but you think that you have problems. We're ordered to move out of here to the border to back up our soldiers and to leave the Chinese to carry on handing out provisions. I doubt we can help.
What's happening at the border? Ethan asked him, now completely deflated, not to mention annoyed that help wasn't to be forthcoming.
Have you not heard? The Union have closed the dam on the Colorado River until the Chinese are ordered to leave. They've shut down all the border roads. Our troops and theirs are massed at the borders, facing each other off. They've stopped importing all food and water with tensions rising unless they can agree on terms. So, sorry, but it isn't looking good for us right now.
That wasn't what he wanted to hear. He couldn't understand what they were doing allowing Chinese soldiers on home soil. What are the Chinese doing here, he asked.
They're supplying us with water and provisions for distribution. Our president authorized their help last month. Apparently, our bio-farming, together with synthetic meat production units, were failing to keep up with demand ever since we nationalized the production units. The Union were dragging their heels to provide emergency supplies unless we compensated the Union investors. It's not just their troops we have facing us, they've been supplying Unionist rebels with weapons, so we have to watch our backs.
Ethan was stunned at the revelation. He had enough on his plate, surviving from day to day, and not having any interest in what was happening in the wider world. Holy crap, does that mean you can't help? The commander pushed back on his chair and rose to his feet.
It all depends on what transpires. We're not due for deployment for 2 days, but if it kicks off, we might have to go in earlier. I'll see what headquarters say tomorrow. I'll arrange with my adjutant for some accommodation for you tonight, so better that you get some sleep. I'll have him wake you tomorrow to give you whatever news I have.
Escorted to a hut, he was given a bed. Others were milling around in there, watching a news program on television, something he didn't own and had no interest in. One of the soldiers joined him.
Not seen you before. Are you here to join our unit?
No. I'm here to ask the commander for help from black marketeers. They've slaughtered my neighbors and taken over their water pump.
Well, good luck with that. There'll be enough slaughter at the border if the Union decide to invade. There's a high-level meeting going on just now to try to avert a war, but our President Hernandez doesn't want to concede to rejoining Cascadia back into the Union. He's only hanging on with the Chinese helping out.
Ethan appreciated that the guy was trying to be friendly, but his mind was screwed at events. Sorry, but I'm just not interested in politics. The secession didn't bother me, just this damn drought that followed. Guess that was just bad timing on Hernandez's part. Ethan noticed a guy over at the television turn to them. He imagined the guy was annoyed at hearing them talking over the broadcast by the agitated look on his face.
Yeah, bad freaking timing, all right. You can say that again. Incredible to think that we went from a self-sufficient economy, larger than most countries, to zilch with all the crops failing. Can't remember the last time I had an orange. Hell, we've lost half the population with migration to the wet states out east and South America, right until the Union prevented them from crossing the border. It is what it is, I guess. Now for God's sake, keep your voices down.
The guy turned back to watch his program, his anger ran over. Ethan really wasn't interested in the wider view unless it involved the survival of his family bubble. It was the reason he chose to live in isolation. He thought that ironic now he was seeking help from the authorities. Look, best I turn in, it's been a long day, said Ethan and climbed onto the bed. As exhausted as he was, there was little chance of sleeping until they decided to turn off the TV. It sickened him to see the images of floods around the world, followed by news of the standoff at the border and negotiations. More than anything, he hoped Jay would stay in the bunker and not go wandering around. Finally, he succumbed to the inevitable and drifted to sleep. Chapter 6. Ethan awoke to a commotion, cracking open his eyes to see a sergeant barking out orders and the guards quickly dressing and gathering their kit. He rose from his bed, dressed, and stepped outside. In the distance, he could see a large aircraft on the runway, with pallets being unloaded by ground crew. A column of trucks lined up in the compound and were quickly manned. They set off in convoy toward the runway. Over at the commander's office, he saw the adjutant who waved him over there. You're to come with me. I need to take you to the armory for your kit. You're to go with the commander into town to inspect the guards carrying out the distribution of supplies. Panic set in at the inference of what he'd said. Whoa there. I'm not joining no army. The adjutant laughed.
Don't you worry. He wants you with him for if he gets word from headquarters about your problem. The kit is for your own protection. It's not exactly safe in town. We have intel that rebels are not far away waiting to see if we're deployed to the border. It'll be up to the Chinese to defend themselves and the compound if they turn up here.
Ethan gulped, while hoping he wouldn't get involved in a local skirmish. He imagined his wife and Jay would be worried he hadn't already returned. Changed into National Guard kit, with an armored vest and plates, he managed to get approval to collect his weapons from the gatehouse. They waited for the commander and his driver to arrive, then climbed in the back and headed into town. Following on was a supply truck and a contingent of Chinese, and behind them a truck carrying a dumpster. Ahead of them, he saw a troop carrier in the distance that had already set off, stacked with what looked like metal barriers. The commander ordered his driver to stop and the vehicles behind sped on by. They waited until a message came through over the radio, then they set off into town. It wasn't what he expected. The homes that lined the road all had their windows boarded. Some with skulls and crossbones painted of garage doors and signs that said looters will be shot. There was the body of an emaciated woman lying dead in the street, but they just passed on by her body. They turned onto a narrow street. Barriers had been placed to funnel the hordes of people on the other side in the street to narrow them down to single file. Given their supplies of water and food, they were ushered down an alley by the soldiers. He looked on as one woman handed over a rifle. They took it from her and tossed it into the dumpster, then gave her what appeared to be double the supplies. Won't the others rob them when they leave? Ethan asked.
It's happened in the past and some were killed for the provisions, but we have troops lined up alongside those waiting to give a chance for the ones given supplies to get home. Everyone will get their share, so there's no point. That wasn't always apparent. Besides, most have given up their weapons for extra supplies.
Ethan flinched at the sound of automatic gunfire. Clearly not all had given up their weapons. The commander picked up the mic and listened to a flurry of messages. He pulled the microphone to his lips.
All units, leave the supply truck here and get to base. There's a large contingent of rebels incoming with heavy armor.
Chapter 7. The commander slammed the mic back on its holder as his driver maneuvered to turn around. Ethan looked over his shoulder as the guards clambered into the troop transporters along with the Chinese. The townsfolk discarded the barriers and were now like ants, crawling all over the supply truck and tossing out supplies. The truck behind them suddenly exploded with a flash of light. The truck following on swerved on by when he saw a rocket-propelled grenade with its vapor trail narrowly missing it and slamming into a rusted-out vehicle, sending it skyward. Like it or not, it looked as though he landed in the middle of a war zone, maybe worse than what he'd left behind at his homestead. Chapter 8. Back at the compound, Ethan was made to wait outside the commander's office. As he looked around, the base wasn't heavily guarded, with most of the guards having left to escort the supply trucks to the outlying districts. Over at the compound perimeter wall, he watched guards release drones into the air, then glue their eyes to the screens of their monitors. Other guards set up mortars at the side of them. Ethan stepped over to the barrier as they were about to close the steel gates. "Hold on a minute, give me a hand to get my drone transport inside." 4 of them helped him to get it inside, then they secured the gates. Ethan climbed onto the seat in his drone, fired up the motors, then traversed it over to behind the commander's office and set it down. At least he thought he had his escape route set up. When he stepped back to outside the office, the commander rushed out, ignoring Ethan as a sergeant arrived. The commander shouted over to the sergeant, clearly agitated.
Get on the radio. I want all supply trucks and their escorts back here. Tell them to use the east entrance at the runway. Our scouts report there are no rebels in that area, thank God. Headquarters are saying the rebels are attacking all compounds away from the border. They think it's to get President Hernandez to concede the Union's demands. We're ordered to stay here and not deploy to the border until the rebels are defeated. Off you go, quickly.
The sergeant nodded, then saluted and scurried away. Ethan looked over his shoulder to see the aircraft take off. It looked as though they were of the same mind as him and to get the hell out of there in case the compound was overrun. All the same, he thought that if the troops were not to be deployed and no attack came, it was worth sticking around to see if the commander would help take care of the black marketeers. He knew Sarah and Jay had enough supplies in the bunker to last them for a year. The only problem was the mental torture they'd go through if he didn't get back there, and soon. His worst fears struck him at an almighty explosion over at the entrance. The rebels weren't going to attack with sticks and stones, that was for sure. Medics charged over there to see to the wounded, but it was looking as though some of the soldiers wouldn't have survived the blast. Someone drove a truck over there and blocked off the entrance, then climbed out of the cab. The commander and his adjutant charged out of the office door. Mortars popped out of their tubes in reply, with guards rushing up the steps to man the wall. It wasn't his fight, and he didn't want to have to take sides, but it was a case of them, or us, kill or be killed. Ethan removed the straps to his hunting rifle and hurried over to the steps and climbed them to where the others had taken position. Apart from that explosion and the return mortars, all was quiet. One of the drone operators sat with his back to the wall next to him. He pointed to a position of 2 rebels manning a mortar. Ethan took in the surroundings of the location, then poked his barrel through a slit in the wall and scoped ahead. At the side of a tree trunk, he saw 2 rebels at a mortar, with one preparing to drop the mortar into the tube. Without hesitation and having the rebel in his crosshairs, he squeezed the trigger. The round took the scalp from the rebel's head and he dropped the mortar harmlessly to the ground, then followed the missile to ground himself. His partner picked up the gauntlet, but this time Ethan's bullet found his target in the guy's chest and he keeled over. Mixed feelings raced through his mind at having had to kill a fellow countryman who had gone into battle for a cause, while he'd done so out of self-preservation. He sighed, just wanting to get back to his family. He thought he was fooling himself, expecting a full-on battle at any moment. Chapter 9. As the hours passed by and the supply trucks with their guards now returned, Ethan felt more secure with the numbers. Thankfully, no more action had taken place, and the drone operators had the positions of the rebels marked in town. Sadly, he was told the rebels were using the civilians as shields. So much for the exchange of weapons for supplies, he thought. That left the town's population vulnerable to abuse from the rebels. thinking that he could understand the policy behind what the government had ordered in case the population turned against President Hernandez's regime. It wasn't as though they'd adopted the Union's constitution when they'd announced seceding from the Union after other states had done so. He shook his head that the political divide at the time had brought the United States close to civil war, the nation torn apart. Ethan sighed, then looked around. He'd have expected the National Guard to have more technologically advanced weapons and artillery, but then one of the guards had told him they were reserved for the soldiers stationed at the border. The adjutant called out to him from below to go to the commander's office. Ethan clambered down the stairway and on over to the office, not knowing why he was wanted there. He doubted it would be for the commander to tell him he'd provide him with a team to take out the black marketeers under the current circumstances. He stiffened up at the door, knocked, then entered. "You wanted to see me," he said. The commander was poring over a map on his desk with a sergeant and the drone operator who'd shown him the position of the mortar team. He looked up, simply nodding, and swayed his arm as if to signal for him to sit. The sergeant folded up the map and stood back with the commander taking his seat at the desk.
"Well now, it appears you're to be commended for taking out that mortar team. Your action deserves that I tell you what's happening. We've had word from headquarters that the rebels have been told to stand down nationwide. It seems the negotiators have come to an understanding. The accord is to be carried out in stages. The Chinese are to be escorted for embarking to China immediately, with a Union delegation allowed to witness them leaving. In return, the rebels will be given safe passage to cross the border. As soon as that is completed, they're to reopen the dam to the Colorado River and resume supplies."
"Does that mean we'll be joining back up with the Union?"
"Apparently not. The negotiations are going to center around what they're calling a United Commonwealth of North American nations. From what I'm told, it won't affect sovereignty. More to do with trade and commerce and agreeing regulations for restrictions on migration and freedom of movement. The armies have been ordered to move 30 miles back from the border on both sides, so that means they'll be taking over the distribution depot here."
Ethan sighed and sighed there wasn't to be a bloodbath. "So, am I free to go back home?" he asked.
"You are, as soon as the army arrive here and the rebels have moved out. We owe you a debt of gratitude for taking out that mortar team like I said. The sergeant here is picking out a team to go with you to take care of your problem. Good luck."
Relief coursed through him that he was to get to deal with the scumbag at John's homestead. The sergeant beckoned Ethan and the drone operator into an adjoining office. It was looking as though it was game on. The sergeant fired up his computer and located a satellite map. Ethan directed him to the area and he zoomed in on John's homestead. It wasn't in real time, but at least it gave the sergeant the layout of the area. The sergeant prodded his finger at the monitor at a clearing 10 miles from the homestead, then stroked at the stubble on his chin.
We'll land the chopper there, then they won't be alerted to us arriving, then we'll hump it over there. Better we go in at night, so you'll need night visions from the armory. Oh, yeah, and collect a set of field comms. Better pick up a drone with a multifunction camera while you're there. Jones here will show you how to use it. How many of them are they, and what weapons do they have?"
He had to think about that before answering. "At most, if they're all still there, I'd say around 25 of them, all with rifles and I assume small arms."
"Okay, listen, you go to the armory with Jones. I'll assemble a team and brief them on the mission. I'll fill you in later on the plan. I'm thinking with you knowing the terrain, it would be better if you and Jones go ahead and advance. You can take your drone transport and I'll arrange for Jones to have one of our drone transporters. You can both land nearer without them hearing you with the electric motors. That way you can report back on what you see to our unit. Better get yours on charge."
As much as he was excited to have the assistance of the National Guard, apprehension struck as they headed over to the armory. The drone camera was far in advance of the one he had back at home and smaller too. By the looks of it, the nano drone would fit on the palm of his hand. This one had daylight, night vision, and infrared. The control wasn't that much different than the one he used when hunting, so it wasn't difficult for him to get the hang of it. As the day drew on and with the Chinese long gone, word from other drone operators reported back that the rebels had vacated the town and had crossed the border. Units from the border started to arrive with some serious heavy armored weapons. The sergeant gave him the nod that it was time for him and Jones to make their way to their drop-off point east of John's homestead. Ethan removed the charger cable from his drone transport and took a seat, firing up the motors. Adrenaline flowed at thoughts of how it would go down, bringing on the shakes of his fingers. He set the GPS with the coordinates of his destination and took a deep breath, then gripped the flight control and soared into the night sky. All he hoped was that they could get the mission over with, without he'd lose his life. Chapter 10. The journey was fraught with tension as he approached the forest, flying no more than 100 yards above the treetops. Fortunately, it was a full moon to be able to navigate without the obstruction of hillsides getting in the way. Night flights weren't something he enjoyed, and he usually avoided them like the plague. A voice came over Ethan's comms telling him to turn off his lights. A glance at his GPS, and they would be nearing their destination, half a mile from John's homestead. Both circled to find a suitable spot to land, but dark clouds now obscured the moon, making it difficult to find a landing spot. Over here, he advised Jones over the comms, and he brought his craft to a hover. It would be tight for the both of them as he carefully maneuvered to land, then pulled up at the last minute when he spotted that he was heading for a boulder but managing to land at the side of it. Jones wasn't so fortunate, almost tipping over the drone as it landed precariously, with one side on a rock, leaving it balanced at 30 degrees. Ethan helped him out of his craft and they loaded up their kit, ready for the hike to the homestead. Jones took out his map and switched on his closed night light, then took out his GPS locator. He pointed to the west and they set off. Ethan had hunted out there, so he hadn't needed the direction and marched ahead to take the lead, until they arrived at that same hillside where he'd observed the sordid affair with Jay. Night visions weren't needed to see all the vehicles and trailers were still there. Smoke rose from the chimney with lights at the windows of the cabin and with all the curtains drawn. All the same, he dropped the night visions to see one of them leaning on the hood of an SUV smoking a cigarette. If that was their only guard, they were risking it. Though thinking about it, they wouldn't be expecting visitors, especially at night. Ethan counted 4 of them stagger out of the front door, laughing and joking, swigging at bottles of what he assumed would be John's stash of his favorite tipple, brandy. One of them called over their guard and handed him a bottle. He took a long swig, then handed it back. It stuck in Ethan's craw. They were laughing at the expense of the murders of John and his sons. A glance at his watch, and if all had gone to plan, the sergeant and his team would have landed and they'd be on their way. It was no different than the first time he'd been there with Jay. All they could do was to observe. Jones leaned over and whispered,
"I'll launch the drone and check the perimeter."
He took out his nano drone and control from his kit bag, launched the drone, and then fixed his eyes on the monitor. Ethan checked his watch again. He estimated it would take the sergeant and his unit around 4 hours to trek the 10 miles before they arrived. He hoped they'd all be asleep by then and they'd be taken without a fight, so he could slip back to his homestead to reunite with Sarah and Jay. Last thing he wanted to witness was their summary execution. The commander had made it clear. The summary judgment and sentence was already set in stone, handed down by Hernandez's executive orders to prevent anarchy. Death by firing squad for looters, or shot on the spot if caught in the act, especially with what he'd witnessed, and what the commander had had him write out as a statement. His signature on his statement had been their death warrant. Their activities in selling their stolen water on the black market, along with the cold-blooded murders they had carried out, they had sealed their own fate. But then, it wasn't over yet, and he knew that even the best laid plans could go awry. Chapter 11. Jones reached out and tapped Ethan on his shoulder. When he turned, Jones put his fingers to his lips and edged over to high to show him the monitor. He must have had it in infrared mode. He could see the heat source of the cabin chimney and at the windows. It appeared he was rotating the camera and kept stopping at heat sources. Ethan counted 8 in all, spread out around the perimeter inside the tree line. Some were static, some moving. Clearly, they were not stupid after all and had the place guarded. He worked the controller and returned the drone. Ethan checked his watch. The wait for the unit to arrive was becoming excruciating with 2 more hours to go. The cabin lights extinguished. It was looking as though they were getting some sleep. He began to worry about those guards out there. This was the National Guard on their way, not special forces that were trained to creep up on targets to take them out quietly. An old hand at keeping hidden when hunting was one skill he possessed, as well as a good aim, but he'd never had to stalk up to a bear and pacify it by slitting its throat. A shiver ran through him at that thought. All he hoped for was that the unit's firepower and their superior numbers would win the day. 2 hours later. Ethan was feeling the cold, his hands numb and his leg muscle cramping. He pulled out his gloves and put them on. Jones launched his drone once more. Both looked at the monitor. The heat sources were there, but now they were all motionless and appeared to be laying down, hopefully asleep. He didn't need the monitor to see the lights come on in the cabin, then 8 of them walk out and call over to the perimeter. They converged in the middle and appeared to be exchanging places on guard, when he heard Jones mumble. When Ethan turned to Jones, he was frantically working the control for the nano drone.
Damn, it's gone down. I lost control and it crashed onto a vehicle hood. I could hear it from here.
Pandemonium erupted with shouts down there in the homestead. Flashlights scanned all compass points and we both hugged the ground on the hillside. Jones pulled his cape over the both of them to hide the light emitted from his monitor, while frantically stabbing at the control to get it airborne and twisting the handle. Wherever it had come down, they'd obviously heard it. On the screen, he could see Boots approaching, with the beam of a flashlight bouncing around, then the screen jumbled. When it focused, a face grew ever larger on the monitor, clearly looking angry. Then the image completely blanked out on the screen and Jones turned off the power to the screen. Ethan cursed internally that the mission was now compromised, and he threw Jones's cape to one side. The Fuhrer must have woke everyone as he saw more of them piling out of the cabin. He looked at his watch when his comms came to life. Unit 1, radio check, he heard in his earpiece. Ethan answered them in a low tone to advise them they'd been compromised. The reply came back with their ETA in 12 minutes, and to stand fast. Down there in the homestead, he could hear raised voices, then vehicle doors slamming. His demeanor hit south, assuming they were evacuating and dared to peek over the ridge. He couldn't work out what they were doing at first, when they drove in a circle. It was soon clear what they were doing as they spaced out evenly, then reversed and maneuvered into a position with their headlights lighting up the perimeter at all compass points and with the guards taking up positions behind the vehicles. Ethan edged back from the lip of the hillside and turned to Jones. Better call your unit and tell them they've circled their vehicles and lit the tree line up. Jones grabbed his backpack and signaled for Ethan to back off. He followed on into the trees, wondering why he hadn't called it in. They arrived at a rocky outcrop, surrounded by trees. Jones unloaded his backpack from his shoulders in a hurry, while talking over his comms. Ripping open the Velcro fastening on his pack, he pulled out and assembled a large drone and then retrieved what appeared to look like a mortar round. He clamped the object to the drone, then sent it skyward with his controller. All he could do was to watch what he was doing with the drone on screen. He could see it was hovering over the inner circle of vehicles. To an exchange of messages over the comms. Ethan saw the object fall from the drone, then to a flash of light and hearing an explosion, the screen widened out. From there on, there was a cacophony of the explosions of rifle fire, when the drone landed back and Jones loaded it up with what he now knew was a grenade. Ethan slipped off his backpack and headed back to the top of the hillside. It was a holy hell of muzzle flashes down there, ripping into their vehicles from the tree line and return fire from the circle of vehicles. Ethan lined up his rifle, eyed glued to the scope, and from his advantageous position on the high ground, he began to pick them off one at a time when to an almighty explosion and screams, another Grenade had landed in the middle of the circle with its shrapnel scything a number of them down. When the dust settled, all went quiet, with only one headlight now working. A single shot, and that too extinguished. He heard a message for everyone to maintain position until further orders. Jones came up alongside of him and this time he sent out the drone without a grenade. Jones shared the screen with him. Behind the circle of vehicles, there was nothing but bodies strewn around. He saw National Guards stalking over there, rifles shouldered at the ready. To a muzzle flash of a single shot from one of the guards' rifles, he imagined that he'd carried out the judgment on one of their injured. 2 guards entered the cabin, with others entering the outbuildings. A series of messages came over the comms that all was clear. Dawn had begun to break. Ethan could now see clearly down the hillside. Although they deserved to die, he gripped his forehead at the sight of corpses strewn around in a carnage of twisted bodies, and he shook his head. He could see what they'd died for, with stacks of cooler bottles filled with water by the water pump. Ethan and Jones made their way down the hillside and then on over to the sergeant. What now, he asked the sergeant.
We'll call in the Forestry Commission agency and have their agents take charge here. They can clear up the bodies and they'll take over control over the water pump.
Ethan glanced around and counted the bodies. He'd miscalculated. There were 22 in all. He turned to the sergeant. Look, I won't be around when the forestry agents arrive. I have to get home. I'll need some of your guards to help me bury the homesteaders. The sergeant called over 2 of the guards to go with Ethan to help bury John and his sons. When they arrived at their corpses, the smell of their bloated, decomposing bodies had him grasping at his knees and throwing up. The guards took out their trench spades and dug the grave. That done, John said a few words over the mounds at their graveside, then headed on back over to the sergeant. "Best I get going. What do I do with the uniform and the equipment?"
Pass me your comms. You can keep the rest. It's not like you can go back naked. If anyone asks, I've appointed you as a reserve guard.
They shook hands and Ethan turned to set off to his drone. He'd managed 4 hours sleep the night before they'd set off on the mission, but with his adrenaline now subsided, he was exhausted. His mind was filled with images of the death and destruction of the last 48 hours, no matter how much he tried to dispel the thoughts as he trekked on. The half-mile back to his drone was like he'd run a marathon on his leg muscles, especially when it came into view and he staggered over there. Once seated, all that changed. All that was on his mind was getting back home and reuniting with Sarah and Jay. On his flight over to his homestead, it bugged him with the numbers of the dead corpses he'd counted. He tried to convince himself that he'd got the numbers wrong, or maybe some of them had gone away on business. All the same, he worried that if Archie had given away the position of his homestead, they could have gone over there. His chest tightened with a bout of anxiousness as he neared his homestead. The drone suddenly tilted, with one of his motors malfunctioning, then it stopped. Cursing under his breath and fighting with the control to straighten it on a level trajectory, he had no option but to look for a place to land. He knew the spot where it would be possible down at the dried-up river bed and prepared for emergency landing, while hoping he wouldn't end up in a tangled mess as he struggled to hover over the landing spot, while fearing he'd crash. Chapter 12. The drone landed while tilted at an angle and thudded on the riverbed with a jolt. At least he'd landed in one piece, he thought, though the frame of the drone looked to be twisted. He climbed out, the relief palpable that he was on firm ground, and he retrieved his backpack and rifles. Ethan pushed on along the riverbed, the bones of critters and fish crunching beneath his boots, then he climbed the bank. He unloaded his backpack and retrieved the nano-drone and the control they'd supplied him with, considering himself lucky he'd not had to hand it over to the sergeant. He launched it skyward and in the direction of his homestead. Eyes glued to the monitor, it zipped over the canopy of trees until he saw his homestead come into view. All looked quiet. There was no sign of any stranger's transport parked up. His paranoia that he might find strangers there with hostile intent subsided. He used the control to check around his outbuildings and cabin. Ethan sighed and returned the drone, then with everything packed, he set off with something of a rejuvenated spring in his step. His body might have felt a surge of energy as he neared home, but he thought his mind had frazzled as he felt a nip in the air, unusual for that time of day, with the sun out, but masked by dark clouds. He froze at hearing voices, fumbling to bring his rifle to the fore and crouched behind a tree stump. He cursed at relying on the drone images and not checking his trail cameras. With one eye closed and the other concentrating on looking through his scope, he traversed his vision around the buildings, seeing nothing, then snatched it back over to the barn when he heard the doors opening. 2 guys pushed out one of the buggies and appeared to be checking it over as if looking for the key fob. Ethan could see the shadows of 2 more inside the barn. He put his rifle down and shrugged off the straps to his backpack and automatic rifle, then retrieved his spare ammo clips and tucked them into place in the pockets on his uniform. He went over his options. With him handing over the comms, he had no way of contacting the National Guard, not to mention his drone transport was out of action. He sighed, not knowing what to do, when the 2 who had been inside the barn stepped out to join the others. A curtain of rage came down when he recognized the one who had been at the cabin door holstering his pistol after he'd heard that single shot that likely took the life of John. He had a flashback to the face of John with all the signs of him been beaten as they buried him. Archie hadn't known anything about the entrance to his bunker, but John did. Then it struck him. Sarah and Jay would have seen them with the camera in the barn and they'd likely be terrified. If they'd tortured John, then his family could be at risk if they managed to defeat the entrance door. He entered a zone void of emotion with only one purpose of mind and picked up his automatic rifle. One shot at a time with his hunting rifle wasn't going to take them all out. He sucked in a deep breath, clicked the switch on his rifle to auto, then stepped out from the cover of the tree trunk and squeezed the trigger, spraying the intruders with rounds. 3 of them dropped right away with their arms flailing until his mag was empty. He cursed that one of them had managed to take cover behind his buggy. Ethan took cover behind a wooden barrel and dropped the mag, then snatched another and clipped it into place. Pistol shots thudded into the barrel, then stopped. He raised his rifle over the top of the barrel and fired back, then quickly hugged the ground to peek over at the buggy. A figure darted inside the barn, firing over his shoulder in his direction, with Ethan returning fire but peppering the barn doors and missing his target. He knew who it was. It was the guy who'd murdered John and the one who had appeared to be in charge of the looters. It was now one-on-one, and he hadn't seen him with a rifle, just his pistol. He tried to recall the number of shots the intruder had made, maybe 8 or 9 he reckoned. That would leave him low on ammo unless he had spare mags. A voice called out,
Hey, you out there! We can settle this amicably. I know you have a water supply. I can make you rich if you join us.
Ethan didn't answer right away, using the opportunity of him waiting for a reply to edge back over to his backpack before replying.
You mean like with Archie and his family before you had them assassinated? The game's over. The National Guard have taken out your crew and they're on their way here right now. I suggest you throw out your weapon and surrender.
The guy didn't think it over, calling back right away.
Fuck you!
Ethan ignored his answer and retrieved the nano drone and launched it, then used the control to get it to hover over the barn. He pulled it back to get a view inside. He could see him dart into a position next to the open barn door. He used the control to have the nano drone land on the roof, then picked up his hunting rifle. He set the crosshairs to where he'd seen him hiding behind the entrance and fired off a round to an instant scream as the bullet smashed through the wooden boards. Ethan lay there waiting, still with his eyes to the scope and hoping the round had had the energy to take him out. There wasn't a sound as he waited for any signs of life. With no sound or movement, he put the hunting rifle to one side and picked up his other rifle, then stalked over to the barrel, stopping briefly, then he stalked over to behind the buggy, ignoring the dead bodies, not taking his eyes off of the entrance to the barn. With still no sounds coming from the barn, Ethan stalked over there to the side of the entrance. He craned his neck, but there wasn't any sound of movement, and he stepped inside, pointing his rifle at to where he expected to see a body and seeing only a blood trail. He span around only to come face to face with the guy and the explosion of 3 rapid rounds and muzzle flashes with the bullets striking him in the chest, taking the wind from him, his rifle dropping from his grip, and he fell backwards, hitting the ground with a thud, the life knocked out of him. The face of his assailant loomed over him, smirking, his pistol at arm's length, pointed right at his head. The guy pulled the trigger to a click. He cursed, then threw his pistol to one side and drew out a knife with a large blade. This wasn't how he wanted his life to end, with Jason and Sarah looking on from the monitor in the bunker, when to a sudden explosion, the guy's head exploded and dropped like a rag doll over Ethan. Someone dragged the body from off of the top of him.
Pa, are you okay? Mom, get the medic kit. He's been shot. His chest is covered in blood.
It's not my blood. Get me to my feet. Jay helped him to stand. Ethan tugged at the Velcro straps and unburdened himself of the armored vest. Sarah joined them and they all hugged him. Get me inside the cabin, will you? I'll be fine, just bruised. He removed his helmet and staggered outside of the barn. Something hit him and he looked skyward at the sky filled with dark clouds. He held out the palms of his hand to feel spots of rain on them. A crack of thunder and the heavens opened with a deluge of rain, soaking them all through. They all joined hands, looking skyward and laughing. It was looking to Ethan as though the big guy upstairs had had enough of the bloodshed and he decided to end everyone's misery. "Thank you, God," he said, then set a huge grin on his lips. Dear listener, if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, and to subscribe for more stories on the channel, with more to come. Declan Conner is the author of a catalog of full-length psychological, crime, and speculative thriller fiction books available on Amazon in all territories. You'll find the link in the description.